3 years ago, if you spotted an electric car in São Paulo traffic, it was probably a novelty, something expensive, imported, and rare. Now it's more like a pattern you can't unsee. According to Bloomberg NEF, Chinese automakers accounted for 89% of EVs sold in Brazil in the first half of 2024, up from 74% in 2023. That's not competition, that's a market swinging on its hinges. And it's not happening in slow motion. Argus reports that in May 2025, BYD alone sold 5,596 battery electric cars in Brazil, more than 80% of all BEV sales that month. If you're an investor watching margins, supply chains, and trade politics, that number hits like a cold glass of water. Here's the uncomfortable part. This looks less like organic demand and more like a carefully financed push. The Center for Strategic and International Studies estimates Chinese government support for the EV industry at about $230.90 billion from 2009 to 2023. Brazil is where that money starts showing up on someone else's showroom floor and on everyone else's balance sheet. Brazil didn't wake up one morning and decide it wanted to become the world's most important EV test market. It happened the way big shifts usually happen in finance. Quietly at first, then all at once. Chinese brands showed up with prices that felt out of place, with product cycles that moved faster than local competitors could match, and with a level of inventory muscle that only makes sense if someone upstream is willing to finance pain for market share. According to Bloomberg NEF, Chinese automakers made up 89% of EV sales in Brazil in the first half of 2024, up from 74% in 2023. In May 2025, Argus reported BYD sold 5,596 battery electric cars in Brazil, more than 80% of that month's BEV market. Those are not normal competitive dynamics. That's a foreign industrial machine landing in a country where the consumer is sensitive, credit is tight, and the political class wants factories and jobs yesterday. The money trail matters. The Center for Strategic and International Studies calculated roughly $230.90 billion in Chinese government support for the EV industry from 2009 to 2023. Investors hear subsidy and think about margins. Governments hear subsidy and think about tariffs. Brazil hears subsidy and sees cheaper cars and a chance to Reuters reported BYD's Brazil factory is expected to be fully operational by the end of 2026, with planned capacity of up to 150,000 vehicles a year. If you want more reporting like this where the numbers matter and the incentives behind them are spelled out, hit like and subscribe. It's the difference between doing one-off takes and building a real series on the money, the politics, and the trade-offs behind the EV shift. And for transparency, every data source referenced in this video is listed in the description. The first thing to understand is that Brazil didn't become a Chinese EV stronghold because Brazilians suddenly fell in love with Chinese brands. It became one because the math started working in a way that looked almost unfair. You had a country that spent years trying to stimulate electrification with low import barriers. And then right as demand finally started to form, Chinese manufacturers arrived with the one weapon that matters most in a middle-income consumer market: price that feels like it belongs to a different universe. When Reuters described Brazil's tariff shift, it captured the timing. Fully electric imports started facing a 10% tax in January 2024, stepped up to 18% in July 2024, and is scheduled to climb to 35% by July 2026. In markets, everyone learns the same lesson early. When you can see the cost curve rising in the future, you pull demand forward. That is exactly what happened. BYD shipped thousands of vehicles into Brazil ahead of tariff steps, exploiting the window where the landed cost was still low enough to undercut incumbents and to condition consumers to a new normal on pricing. This is where the 75% in 3 years claim from the original transcript needs tightening. The cleaner way to tell it is with the numbers we can actually pin down. Bloomberg NEF reported that Chinese automakers made up 89% of EVs sold in Brazil in the first half of 2024, up from 74% in 2023. That is the dominance headline, and it explains why investors should care. Once a brand ecosystem crosses that kind of threshold, it stops behaving like a normal competitive market. It starts behaving like a supply chain and pricing regime that foreign players set. By mid-2025, the concentration got even more vivid. Argus reported that in May 2025, BYD sold 5,596 battery electric vehicles in Brazil, more than 80% of all BEV sales that month. That's not a slow grind. That's a takeover, and the only place that really counts. The monthly sales sheet. If you're trying to explain how a company can do that without bleeding out, you end up back at Chinese industrial policy. The Center for Strategic and International Studies estimated roughly $230.90 billion in government support for China's EV industry from 2009 to 2023. That figure matters less as a political talking point and more as a financial clue. It suggests there's a long runway of policy-backed capacity factories, supply chains, R&D, tax treatment that can absorb thinner margins overseas for longer than a purely private system usually tolerates. And Brazil is not just an export market anymore. It's becoming part of the production map. Reuters reported BYD began construction on a manufacturing complex in Bahia with projected capacity of 150,000 vehicles per year, and later reported that officials now expect the site to be fully operational by December 2026 after delays still targeting up to 150,000 units annually. That is a familiar playbook in trade history. You flood a market early while tariffs are low, you establish demand and service networks, then you localize assembly to blunt the next round of protectionism. If that sounds familiar to an American audience, it should. In the early 1980s, Japanese automakers were swallowing US market share so quickly that Washington pushed Tokyo into a voluntary cap on exports. The National Security Archive notes Japan announced voluntary export restraints on May 1, 1981, limiting auto exports to the US for a period under pressure from the Reagan administration. That episode didn't end the competition. It changed its shape. Japanese firms leaned harder into higher value models and accelerated local production in North America. The lesson wasn't exports stop. The lesson was exports become factories. Brazil is now running through a version of that movie, except the cast is Chinese. The product is electrified, and the policy backdrop is messier. As Brazilian tariffs ramp back up, the obvious response is more local assembly, more CKD-SKD strategies, more investment promises in. Brazilian authorities are already tightening the screws. Reuters reported Brazil decided to bring forward tariff hikes for disassembled electric and hybrid vehicles, moving a 35% import tax to January 2027 for CKD-SKD imports instead of the later timeline previously planned. So when people say China dominates Brazil's EV market, it's not just about brand perception, it's about a timed financial operation. Ship hard before tariffs bite. Lock in price expectations. Then build just enough local footprint to keep the machine running when the border gets more expensive. If you want to know why the Chinese advance in Brazil didn't stop at cheap imports, look at the one constraint that turns EV hype into EV reality, where you plug the thing in. In the US, people argue about range anxiety like it's a personality trait. In Brazil, it's geography and logistics. You can sell a battery car at the right price, but if the charging map looks empty outside a few urban corridors, the buyer starts calculating weekends, family trips, bad roads, and the one nightmare scenario where the battery hits single digits far from home. Brazil's charging network is growing, but it's still a thin blanket. According to ABVE, citing data compiled with 2P Mobilidade, Brazil had 12,137 public and semi-public charging points in November 2024, rising to 14,827 by February 2025. Forbes Brazil later reported ABVE numbers showing 10,622 points in August 2024 and 16,880 by September 2025, a sharp jump that still leaves the country unevenly covered. Those are points, not the kind of dense, redundant web Americans see along interstates, and they're not spread like peanut butter. Half concentrated in one macro region means the rest of the country is effectively negotiating with distance. Now, put that next to China. You hear millions of chargers tossed around, and it sounds like propaganda until you see credible tallies. An ICCT research brief estimated China had deployed about 2.93 million public chargers by the end of 2024. China's own regulators and industry reporting go even further on public points by 2025. One report citing China's National Energy Administration put public charging points at 4.3 million as of August 2025. The International Energy Agency frames the same reality from another angle. China accounted for about 70% of the world's public light-duty vehicle charging stock in 2023, and it keeps adding at a scale that other countries struggle to match. Around 850,000 public points added in 2024 alone, according to the IEA's Global EV Outlook 2025. That charging asymmetry isn't trivia. It shapes what Brazilians buy. When the infrastructure's patchy, hybrids become the rational compromise. Argus described Brazilian consumers' preference for hybrids plug-in or not because charging outside major urban centers is still limited, with PHEVs especially attractive for the electric in town. Gasoline on the highway flexibility, and Adv's own sales totals show how big the electrified category has become when you include hybrids. ABVE data reported by Argus put Brazil's electrified vehicle registrations at about 177,360 in 2024, nearly doubling from 2023. That matters because it explains why Chinese brands can win even when BEVs face friction. Sell the bridge technology, build brand habit, then pull the market further into full electric as the network fills in. For an American finance audience, this is where the comparison gets uncomfortable, because the US also lives and dies by build-out speed. according to a Congressional Research Service report. In January 2025, the United States had 75,107 public charging stations and 207,227 public charging ports. Reuters, citing U.S. government oversight and program reporting, put the U.S. at roughly 219,000 publicly available charging ports nationwide, while noting how slowly the federally funded NEVI build-out was moving. Only 384 ports constructed under that program as of April 2025, according to the GAO. So here's the Brazil point. A market can be open and still behave like a gated community if infrastructure doesn't follow sales. That's why Chinese manufacturers aren't just dumping cars into Brazil. They're trying to reshape the adoption curve around the constraints. The faster they normalize hybrids and low-cost BEVs in dense metro areas, the more they can pressure the rest of the system utilities, retailers, real estate developers to treat charging as basic plumbing. This isn't new in economic history. Railroads in the 19th century didn't win because the locomotives were pretty. They won because the track got laid, the standards got set, and then every other business had to route through that network. Same logic with shipping containers in the 20th century. Once the ports and cranes standardized, global trade didn't just grow, it snapped into a new shape. EVs are doing the same thing. China built the ports first. Brazil is buying the ships now, and still trying to pour the concrete. The question for investors isn't whether Brazil will add chargers, it will. The question is who gets to own the customer while the country is still catching up. What happened in Brazil should make a US finance audience uneasy for a reason that has nothing to do with cars. It's the speed at which a global industry can flip when one country can manufacture at scale, subsidize endurance, and then pick off markets that don't have the political appetite for a full industrial response. According to Bloomberg and EF, Chinese automakers reached 89% of EV sales in Brazil in the first half of 2024. Argus put BYD at more than 80% of Brazil's BEV market in May 2025. That's not just a brand story, it's what market structure looks like right before pricing power migrates. Once consumers, dealers, and service networks get trained around one ecosystem, competitors don't just need a better product, they need a better financing stack, a better supply chain, and a better political tailwind. The lesson here isn't that tariffs always fail or that subsidies always win. It's that timing beats ideology. Brazil raised import taxes on EVs and is phasing them up. Yet the window before each step created a surge dynamic that favored the players who could ship volume early and absorb margin pressure. Reuters tracked the tariff schedule rising from 10% in January 2024 to 18% in July 2024, with plans to reach 35% by July 2026. At the same time, Reuters reported BYD's Brazil complex aims for capacity up to 150,000 vehicles a year, once fully operational by the end of 2026. That combination, tariffs rising, localization rising, means the competitive fight shifts from ports to factories. That's when it gets harder to reverse. Infrastructure is the other tell. ABVE's charging point figures show Brazil expanding fast but still uneven, which is why hybrids and plug-ins act like a bridge that keeps market share compounding while the grid catches up. If you're investing in autos, batteries, commodities, or even utilities, Brazil is a live case study in how adoption curves get engineered by pricing, policy, and the physical network under it. So here's the question I want you to answer in the comments. If Brazil can swing this hard, this fast, without being a rich country or a core Western market, which major economy do you think is next to end? What industry gets Braziled after EVs? If you want more videos like this, hit like and subscribe. It's how this channel keeps funding the research and the reporting.